Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway, and my guest this week is Russell Dobular. Russell lives in New York City, where he's a playwright and the owner and artistic director at Endtimes Productions, an independent theater film production company. And he's also a political commentator appearing on the Due Dissidence Podcast with Keaton Weiss, who was my guest a few weeks ago. So welcome, Russell.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Maybe you can begin by telling us when you first got interested in politics and a little bit about how your politics has evolved since then.
You know, I was always interested in politics. I was one of those weird kids who would impersonate the president. So I always was interested. My politics evolved quite a bit over the last few years, though. I mean, you know, I grew up in a very blue collar section of Queens. Today it's very transformed. I grew up in Flushing, and today Flushing is actually not only the largest Chinatown in New York, it's the largest Chinatown on the planet. Right. But when I was growing up, it was much more the grandchildren of Ellis Island. You know, it was very Irish, Italian, and Jewish. You know, third generation descendants. You know, sections of New York like Howard Beach, Staten Island are still kind of like that. And when I was a kid, you couldn't find a Republican with a search party in that kind of a neighborhood. I mean, everyone was a Democrat, but they were New Deal Democrats. And once Bill Clinton got elected and the New Democrats took over, I personally witnessed the transformation. And today, you can't find a Democrat in my old neighborhood. Nobody. People. And I'm still in touch and very close with a lot of the people that I grew up with and their families. All those people were Democrats when I was a kid, and they're all Republicans now.
Really? They made that change?
All of them. They're either Republicans or apathetic. So that definitely made some changes. But look, you know, I went off to college, and I definitely absorbed the whole neoliberal worldview. And I was a huge fan of Bill Clinton. And in fact, in 2008, I started out supporting Hillary Clinton over Barack Obama. And I started out supporting Hillary Clinton over Bernie in 2016. But I think for a lot of people who have a similar story to my own, you know, if you listen to Jimmy Dore, he has a very similar story. That election really was transformative for a lot of people. The events that went on, if you were paying any kind of attention, it made it impossible to continue, if you were a thinking person, to believe a lot of the things that your faith in the Democratic Party establishment and the media that supports it had been predicated on. Your basic belief that, hey, they really want to do these things, you know, if they had the chance, we'd be Norway. You know, it's just these damn Republicans. And, you know, you're really trained by the media to admire the gamesmanship of, you know, telling people to dissect what the meaning of the word is and things like this. Really admire it as part of the art of political gamesmanship. But the moral that underlies all that, what allows you to swallow all that, is the belief that they really are on the same page ideologically with you, the person who believes in universal health care and higher wages. And it's just the Republicans get in the way. And, you know, the belief that, yes, the media is biased towards establishment Democrats, but that's because establishment Democrats are on the side of the truth. So if they're journalists telling the truth, well, naturally, reality has a Democratic bias, right? I swallowed all that shit. I believed all of it until I put my finger in the wind in 2016. And I said, you know what? For the first time in my lifetime, the Paul Tsongas guy, the Dennis Kucinich guy, the Al Sharpton guy, there's a guy like that in every presidential election cycle I can remember. And you love him, but you know he can't win, right? You know, he gets 5% of the vote. Because of the strange circumstances of the moment, you realized, holy shit, this Bernie Sanders guy could actually win. This guy could actually win. We could actually get these things done. And when you saw the response to that possibility from the party establishment, and perhaps even more shockingly from the media, that was a red pill moment. You know, it just it broke you out of the matrix, and you realized that everything you'd ever believed about politics your entire life was a complete load of horseshit. That all of it was a lie.
Yeah. Well, it really struck me. I mean, this was, I think, in my lifetime, even the first time that a really progressive sounding candidate had a prayer of winning the nomination.
Sure.
And then they stole it from him. And then he flipped right around and supported Hillary Clinton, who was opposed to everything he said he believed in. And, you know, it's a thing like that, even though not everyone sees it the same way, I think it destroys faith in the system, not just in the Democratic Party, but in the whole system. And of course, Donald Trump is not exactly a faith-inspiring character. So, you know, the alternative wasn't very good.
Well, the fact that he won really reinforces the fact that Bernie would have won.
Yeah.
Because that demonstrates to you, unlike the Democrats, they want to spin it the way they spin everything. Everyone is stupid. Everyone's inferior. Everyone's a racist troglodyte if they're not, if they don't grind their own coffee beans. But the frustration and anger in the country was such that they preferred anyone who was not the status quo.
Right.
Now, if you had given them somebody who's not the status quo, who's not Donald Trump, they would have voted for that person.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I mean, it's the old thing. Bernie would have won. Yes, he would have won. Based on any objective measure. He was doing better against Trump in the polls than Hillary in almost every poll that was ever taken. And then this time, I mean, it didn't even surprise me this time because of last time was eye-opening. But when they did what I call the Monday Night Massacre, the night before Super Tuesday this time, I saw that coming. To be honest with you, I worked my ass off for Bernie in 2016. I did very little other than donate this time. Because by this time I was going into it knowing the system is rigged. They're never going to let this guy be the nominee. They're never going to allow it. Never. They will sooner burn the whole thing down, which they just demonstrated when the DSA swept the Nevada Democratic State Party, and they all quit and they took the money. They took $450,000 out of the party. So, that's a point Keaton was making in our last podcast.
But it's a thing. If you take over the party, they will render it just a shell,
right?
Because you won't be able to take over the money that they have now. No, you won't be able to take over the campaign contributors because they are all pushing for the neoliberal agenda that makes them rich.
Exactly. And, they have no interest in this party as anything other than a vehicle to their own wealth and power
Yeah, but that,
and lifestyle.
yeah, and that brings us
You
to
take that
yeah.
away from them, they have no personal interest in this party as an institution.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of interest in the Republican Party as an institution either. I mean, I think there's interest in Donald Trump as an individual. You know, I think they like him. I think because he's, he's like the wrench you threw into the gear. You know, he just messes everything up, and that's fine. But you know that what grabs me so much. I mean, we're in a situation now. Where every time I drive, and I'm in Eugene, Oregon, which is a fairly small town, 160,000. Everywhere I drive, there are homeless people living in tents, the side of the road, in the parks, along the river. If you go to Portland, you see the same thing. I don't know about New York; it may be the same thing.
Well, in New York under Giuliani, they basically pulled a Soylent Green with the homeless population. They started enforcing vagrancy laws, basically to hide the homeless. So the police began confronting homeless people. You can go to a shelter, or you can go to jail, but you can't stay here.
But with progressive de Blasio in office, and hasn't that all changed now?
It's very hard to say because we've all been locked in the house for a year. So there hasn't been street life, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, not really.
I'm not out and about interacting with the world outside in that way. Nor is anybody else really. It's difficult other than essential workers. It's difficult to say what it's going to look like afterwards. I can say that right up to the moment of the pandemic, de Blasio or no de Blasio, the homeless were rendered invisible virtually in New York. I mean, a few random people around, but nothing like what you might see in San Francisco, say.
Yeah. Well, lots of parts of Oregon, particularly Eugene and Portland, have a different point of view. I mean, they've elected people who have a real concern about, why should we, it's not fair to lock up the homeless when there are no homes for them and no place to put them. So, there's not really a lot of interference with them living where they want to live.
Right.
And so they do.
Right.
But, it's a thing. I was reading something just a couple of days ago also about, climate change and, the likelihood of flooding in the Northeast, particularly because of changes in the Gulf Stream and so forth. And the fact that pretty much 90% of the dams in the Northeast are, like very precarious situation. I mean, our whole infrastructure is a mess.
Yeah.
We've got zero high-speed rail compared to, the thousands and thousands of miles that China has. It looks like this looks kind of like an empire on the way down.
It kind of does.
Kind of, yeah. You think?
Yeah. I mean, of course it is. It's very difficult to make the case that America is not a failed state, even now. We're already there. I read a very interesting article by somebody who was from a country that had collapsed, that had had a civil war and collapsed. And he said, I can't remember which country, but he said in this article, collapse is not what you think it is. It's not as if one day there's an announcement that your society has collapsed. And it's not as if all of a sudden everyone stops going to work and there are no businesses. It's just that gradually the institutions of your society have collapsed. And what you accept as normal is deeply abnormal. But it happens in such a way that you grow accustomed to it.
Right.
That is essentially where we are.
Yeah.
This is a failed state. When you have, I believe Keaton was talking about this on your show also. When you have 67 some odd percent of people who can't afford a $500 emergency in the wealthiest country on earth in terms of per capita GDP, in what way is that not a failed state? When you're talking about a country that does not provide basic necessities to its citizens, that every other country in its economic and technological strata provides, like healthcare and a college education, what is that other than a failed state? And when you give the so-called left party all three branches of government, and they hide behind an unelected rule checker to get around raising the minimum wage, what hope do you have for getting the kind of systemic changes that would be necessary to reverse the trajectory of rampant inequality that is certainly, I would say, the prime mover of our imperial decline?
Oh yeah, no. That's part of this is the frustration too. I mean, in a democratic society, in a healthy society, there would be a political mechanism for people who felt that the system was going down the tubes, that it wasn't giving them what they needed in order to have a decent life. They would have a political path toward making that different.
Right.
There is no such path here. We don't have
that's democracy.
Yeah, we don't have democracy.
Well, this is another thing that Democrats in their elitist condescension love to.
I remember New York City always being like
that. It's a little more active today. It's warmer out. They always like to cast the American people as stupid, and increasingly and very alarmingly, they're really getting obsessed with controlling communication and speech. But, and that's a natural outgrowth of having that kind of a worldview. But if you actually look at the polling, the wisdom of crowds upon which democracy is predicated still works just fine. The majority of people want universal health care. The majority of people, look, this is America. Do we want what they did about guns in Australia? Like basically you can't have one? No, it's still America. If you're absolutely intolerant of guns, well, you need to go somewhere else. But the vast majority of people have reasonable views on restrictions on guns. The majority of people want to legalize marijuana. The majority of people want to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. There's nothing wrong with the people. There's something wrong with the system.
Yeah.
What kind of democracy? I mean, it's so obvious that it's not even really debatable. If your understanding of democracy is that collectively the people are going to tend to make good decisions for themselves, and they elect representatives who will then enact their will, then clearly we no longer have a democracy, because that's not happening. It has not been happening for a very, very long time. No. What we have are politicians at the service of their donors, very wealthy individuals and corporations. You have a media complex that is really no better than state-controlled TV. If you, the reason it comes out that way is different, but the end product is the same. In a totalitarian state, they're going to tell you what to report. In our case, the combination of access journalism, a confluence of interests between the owners of media outlets, the class that the people who are doing the reporting tend to be drawn from, and the politicians and their donors, and fear of unfavorable regulation. And you put that all together and you have state TV. It's the same thing. They don't report when Nancy Pelosi refuses to allow the committee to vote on a bill that would force members of Congress not to hold stocks. They don't tell you that. That's not on the front page of the Times. They don't talk about that in relation to how much money she's made in Congress trading stocks, or how much her husband has made trading stocks. They don't talk about that. Just like if you were in China, they would not tell you about the foibles of members of the party, and unless they turned against them for whatever reason, unless somebody got singled out in Orwellian fashion for the 2 minutes hate. They're not going to tell you about that. But
that's why they've got to crack down on alternative media, social media. You know, people who are doing podcasts and posting them on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. I mean, they just knocked Vanessa Beeley, who's a good independent journalist in the UK, off YouTube this week. I mean. They have to knock them off. Glenn Greenwald has a great article about the attack on Substack, which he's on, right. by the mainstream journalists. But ultimately, that feeds into this. I mean, nobody's trusting the media, nobody's trusting the government.
That's something else the public gets right.
There's no institution.
But this is what you're dealing with the Democrats. Look, they argue that the Republican base are the dumbest people in the country. I disagree. No. I think Democrats are the dumbest people in America, because if you look at independents, their trust in the media has dropped tremendously over the last 40 years. If you look at Republicans, obviously their trust has dropped tremendously. There is only one group of people in the country who hasn't noticed that the media has changed over the last 40 years. That's Democrats. They're the only ones who express the same level of trust that people had in the media 40 years ago. This is what you're dealing with, and this is why they're terrifying. And I don't want to, of course, there's kind of a law. If you have a political conversation long enough, everything comes back to the Nazis. But when I look at the Democrats, and I look at how they're cheerleading unaccountable tech oligarchs, deciding which speech is admissible, and cheering the removing of services from tech platforms like Parler. When I see them cheering that on, I can't help but think of good Germans. They're in a lot of ways, the people who are most dangerous when things like this are happening are not really the firebrands out in the street. It's those people. It's those people who are too stupid to sit and think for a moment about the implications of what they're supporting.
Well, let's talk about some of the dangers, because I think this is the thing that worries me even more about this, because as I say, we don't really have a political mechanism to fix this. But even if we did, we don't really have time. No. We've got an environmental catastrophe that's coming on us, slowly but very surely. And then we have a Democratic administration now that looks like it's trying to start a war with as many countries as possible all at once.
Well, what else is new?
And there's really, every time you look at these, what I call the designated enemies of the United States, there's no real reason. None of these nations pose any threat to the United States at all. No way.
Sure.
And they always talk about our national interests, but we don't really have that interest. It is not a national interest. It is a corporate interest. It might be a banking interest, but but eventually, when you've got an economy that's based on more or less air, and you've got an infrastructure that's dead, you've got no manufacturing capability to speak of. The education level of your population is dropping. The health level of the population is dropping.
Yep.
So how are you going to support this empire that you want, Biden is telling everybody that America is back. I mean, everybody's going like, did we ask for that? But how do we support it?
Me and Keaton have talked a lot about this. I'm personally of the belief that you really have not seen what the pandemic has done to the economy, because we've been frozen in amber for a year.
Yeah.
Right. No, you're not going to see what the new world looks like until everyone's vaccinated, the restrictions are lifted, and you're actually walking around and living a life. That's when you're going to see the bars that are closed. That's when you're going to see the art spaces that are gone. That's when you're going to see all the businesses that have collapsed. So I don't think we've even begun to see what the results of this are. And the country was already unstable enough to elect Donald Trump before any of this happened.
Yeah.
What's it going to be like now? And this is why, and this was coming for a very long time. It doesn't matter if it's coming from the left or it's coming from the right. It was always very clear, probably very clear to a lot of the people who have been militarizing the police forces, like Obama, over the last couple of decades, giving them military equipment that no small town police force should ever need.
Yeah, exactly.
That it's going to get to the point where the only way to govern is going to be through true, straight up fascist police state control. Because when the population is that restive, you only have two choices. You can either buy them off, or you can kill them and jail them and suppress them. And to do the former would mean giving up some of their wealth and power. And they would much prefer to drum up the idea. Look, the people who did the March 6th Capitol thing,
January 6th, yeah.
January 6th, sorry. That was like 9/11 for everyone who essentially wants to make this a police state. That just like 9/11 served as the greatest pretext Bush, Cheney, and all the rest of the psychos could have asked for. I mean, all of the stuff in the Patriot Act, this was stuff Cheney was advocating for when he worked for Nixon.
Sure.
These kinds of expansions of executive power.
No.
So this just gave them a great excuse. The January 6th riots, you see that they're using it as a pretext to basically build a police state.
Well, the last 4 years, the Democrats have been hammering away at Russiagate, and basically, I mean, MSNBC has been telling all the progressives that the FBI and CIA are their friends, and we should support them and everything they're doing. I mean, they forgot entirely about the 60s.
That is perhaps the strangest thing that I have seen in the Trump years, and there is a lot of stiff competition for that designation. The strangest thing I have seen is people who are ostensibly left, what we call liberals as opposed to leftists. But to see people who consider themselves having a left orientation embracing the intelligence services and lionizing criminal cretins, literal criminals like John Brennan, and holding them up because, hey, they're against Donald Trump. They don't like Donald Trump. To hold these people up like a bunch of patriotic fucking Boy Scouts. This is why I say Democrats are the dumbest people in America. How stupid. I have never seen the corporate media at the behest of the political establishment feed them a line of bullshit that was too absurd for them to swallow. I've never seen them show a limit on what bullshit they are willing to believe. And listen, with the Republicans, I wrote a speculative article about, hey, You might be better off trying to reform the Republican Party into a working class party
Oh, yes.
than the Democratic Party. And I mean, really, my purpose was with that article was to illustrate the almost, I'm sorry, futility of really trying to break, because you could make just as strong an argument, if not stronger, that you should go take over the Republican Party. And this is why. They have elections. They actually have elections. They didn't want Donald Trump. They had every reason to believe that he was going to be destroyed in the election. Whereas the Democrats, based on the polling, they had no reason to believe that about Bernie Sanders. Quite the opposite. I mean, in terms of the numbers, they had more reason to worry about nominating Hillary Clinton than Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
That didn't matter. That didn't matter. But the Republicans, and look, Trump was out there talking all this kind of populist kind of shit. He didn't mean any of it, but he was talking it, stuff that's very much against their donor bases, economic interests, and orthodoxy. And they let the process play out. And also, in terms of their voters, if you remember, the whole conservative media complex was beating up on Donald Trump at the beginning. Fox News was no Donald Trump fan.
No.
Shit, Morning Joe were more into Donald Trump than Fox News was at the beginning. And yet the Republican voters said, go fuck yourselves. We don't care.
Oh, yeah.
We want this guy. Look at the difference. Democratic voters in this election in 2020, they expressed the most trust and agreement with Bernie Sanders on every issue. And they didn't even particularly like Joe Biden. But when Barack Obama told them who to vote for, they just did it.
They just saluted. Exactly. And there's no question in my mind that Joe Biden, of all the candidates, possibly excepting Kamala Harris, was the worst possible candidate. You know, the least charismatic.
Mayor Pete.
Okay, well, but Mayor, yeah, I don't know. But yeah, and there's something also. I mean, what they keep trying to do, and I think the Biden administration has done this with their picks for cabinet. There's a certain way in which they're trying to distract us from the real issues with all of this identity politics.
Oh, absolutely.
You know,
well, you could see it very clearly in the way they tried to defend Tandon.
Yeah.
I mean, they're taking it to such a level of absurdity that I don't even think the liberals can buy it.
No.
I mean, it was so clearly Neera Tandon was so obviously like a serious contender for biggest asshole in Washington. Like, how do you turn that into? Like, it's sexism.
Yeah, misogynist. Yes, exactly. But yeah, we keep getting that, and I'm enjoying the little pictures on Facebook about the people over in the Arab countries saying, well, now the bombs are being dropped on this by blacks and women and white people, so it's much better now. But that's exactly what we're doing. But all right.
That's why the neoliberals had to go all in on identity politics, because it's the only way that they can distinguish themselves from the Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
Once they moved to the right economically, they moved way to the left on those issues. Too far, really. I mean, they adopted a lot of crackpot postmodern theory that is also a big underexplored part of why Donald Trump became the president.
Oh yeah, no, the Republican Party loves that. I mean, when they can point out whether it's transgender bathrooms or banning Dr. Seuss books or whatever it is. I mean, they make hay out of that big time. I mean, that's and that's associated with everything leftist and socialist, and which is not.
well, of course, and it's never really explored. Of course, it's not explored in the media, and this is one case where I'd say they're probably too ignorant to even be aware of it. We don't get along. The economic left and that left, we usually don't really get along.
Mhm.
The economic left tend to be liberal universalists on matters of race, gender, sexuality. We tend to be very MLK.
Mhm.
People should be judged by the content of their character and not any of those classifications. And that's it. You want to start talking about everyone's lived experience is valid. Shut the fuck up. Shut up. Some people are assholes in all categories.
Yeah.
Okay, not everyone's lived experience is equally valid. I'm working on a piece about that as well, because
Mhm.
I think a lot of people who use these expressions, my truth, my lived experience, because I know a lot of people who are, good and decent people who speak in these terms now because it's fashionable.
Mhm.
I don't think they really understand what the philosophical premises of postmodernism upon which these phrases are predicated are. Because if
Yeah.
you ask the average person who uses these phrases, so do you believe that scientific method is just a cultural construct that does not actually express any kind of objective reality? You probably don't believe that, right? Well, if you don't believe that, you probably shouldn't use these kinds of expressions, because these expressions reflect
Right.
a worldview that is based on the idea that language is all cultural and it's all about power
Mhm.
dynamics, and all of our means of uh, of creating epistemology is based on a social construct based in language, so that there is no knowable objective reality through culture. Do you believe that? I don't think most of the people who have gotten on board with the critical theory school of thought
Mhm.
really understand what they're signing up for. I don't think they really get it.
No, and there are huge implications to that. You may not have noticed it, but if you haven't, Barry Weiss, late of the New York Times,
Yes.
has a Substack now that has some very interesting articles about how this is playing out among the elites,
Right.
or
Right.
the near elites, actually.
Right.
That is really frightening. I mean, and I see it in universities around. We've
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, we have to teach history correctly, but that
Mhm.
doesn't mean we have to denigrate everything that was written by people who would not match up to our current standards of racism and sexism. I mean, you can't do that.
Well, we're also, I mean, it falls apart under its own premises if you actually, this is what I'm saying, people don't really examine these premises. This is where we should be having debates at
Mhm.
universities, but because of the Mao's cultural revolution nature of it, you can't have that debate.
No.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
really, people should be digging into. Okay, so you're saying that all systems of knowledge are culturally relative and all based in power, and there's no knowable objective reality. So why should we listen to you then? What makes aren't you expressing some
Yeah.
kind of a reality? So what make if you're saying there's no expressible or knowable truth, then why don't you stop talking? Why am I supposed, what is the ideological underpinning? What is your argument for me going along with your beliefs or your movement if your movement is predicated on the idea that there's no knowable reality? So your belief is not any better than mine. And for that matter, your beliefs are not any better under this schema than a white nationalist, right? You've just given white nationalists the greatest philosophical justification that something they could never have come up with on their own. We
Mhm.
all live our own reality. Okay, right? So they're living their truth, to go goose stepping through the middle of
Oh
town.
yeah. Right.
That's their
Mhm.
truth. They're living their truth, right? How do you
Yeah.
It's all
But
culturally relative, right?
yeah.
They're from a different region of the
and
country
and I think
originally.
it's also another intellectual evidence of the decline of the empire, or the failure of the empire, because this is a civilization that's not progressing.
Well, on that level, I think societies generate paradigms that reflect that culture. So if you look at the Greeks and you look at Greek philosophy, they were basically in the process of inventing civilization. So they were very concerned with ideas of the relationship between the individual and the state, and what the proper organization of a state is, and that's a reflection of the world that they lived in. What could more reflect a society that encourages a deep pathological narcissism in its citizenry than for the population to embrace a philosophy that tells everybody that your personal truth is paramount and supersedes any assertion of a reality beyond it? That's like the narcissist Bible. Right?
I hear you. Well, let's I want to wrap this up here before we I'm hoping Zoom doesn't pull the plug on us. But because the one thing I always like to get around to is like, okay, so what do we do about it? I mean, what can we do about it? Do we just sit around and wait for the inevitable collapse in one way or another? Or is there some way we can move out of this?
I think I'm on the same page with Chris Hedges. So if you look at a lot of what he has to say, he considers the collapse inevitable. Clearly, I mean, all of his writings and speeches are essentially, this is happening. Yeah, we're going down. He argues for the purpose of activism, even in the face of collapse, basically on a moral, philosophical rather than a logistic level, that this is a moral duty,
right,
to stand up against essentially the forces of darkness, right? That's up to the individual to reflect on where they want to be under those kinds of circumstances. On a practical level, yes, the system is too broken to be fixed through regular order democracy, and the population is too broken, divided, dysfunctional, psychologically and physically unhealthy to fix it through collective action. It would be great if they could. That would be the only way it could happen. If you want to hurt them where they live, you'd have to boycott capitalism. I mean, essentially, everyone stopped buying anything other than essential goods and services, and you'll bring them to their knees within a month. But we're not going to do that. No. This is what I said. We were offline before, or off recording. I'm too honest. I cannot tell people, no, this is what we got to do. We're going to organize strikes, and we're going to, in theory, that is what would need to be done. I'm just telling you that's not what's going to happen.
Well, yeah. And the other thing that, with Chris and his ideas on this, I mean, yes, I think we can't accomplish anything, but the fact is that if we don't do something, that damages us. I mean, it's horrifically depressing to say, everything's collapsing around me. There's nothing I can do about it but sit here. So I'm just going to watch. And no, that's not workable. You got to do something.
Well, you're gonna really like my next article, because I don't know if you watched. I call myself the socialist day trader, because I do that. So I did a lot of coverage on the whole GameStop thing.
Mhm.
And looking at the GameStop thing and the Wall Street Bets threads that spawned it led me to continue to research, because I was kind of fascinated by this online Gen Z culture
Mhm.
that really gets no media attention except through caricature, right? Incels on 4chan. That's not what I am finding. What I am finding is the old counterculture, and I'm sure you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Basically, from the 50s into the early 90s,
Mhm.
there was a style of American counterculture that every generation had its own spin on, that was inherently anti-consumerist, inherently anti-conformity, um, very questioning of society, questioning of authority, going all the way back to Brando. What are you rebelling against? What do you got? That was the animating spirit of the counterculture of America, particularly in its youth for generations. And then it was weird because it almost looked like the counterculture disappeared, right? Because you wouldn't credibly call hipsters counterculture, right?
No.
And my assumption was, I guess growing up with the technology, with the internet, with the iPhones, I guess it just melted their brains and they're just not generating those kinds of thoughts. I guess they just got so saturated by consumerism and commercialism through the internet, and they just didn't go in that direction. No, that's not the case. That's not the case. It's that there is a counterculture that's very much that traditional counterculture. They generate their own art that is very much the kind of trippy stuff that you would have seen in a head shop in the 70s, like that, but relating to what's going on in the world now. Dark dystopian visions, things like that. These kinds of t-shirts, their own version of that. There's no place for them in the media, and so they're being rendered invisible, which on another level seems to kind of be how they like it. And this is where the 4chan thing comes in. They're going to corners of the internet where they're basically not going to be paid attention to. And if you look at what their worldview is, what their philosophy is, it's very nihilistic. It's very much a rational response to the circumstances coming from young people not burdened with the past to distort their clear perception of what's actually in front of them. They can see that the government is fucked. They can see that this system is not working. They can see that, it's just out of control capitalism. And so what have they done? They've done what the kinds of rebellious kids that I certainly was, I don't know about you, Charles, what we would have done with technology. They created Anonymous. They broke hedge funds by buying up a company that was heavily shorted. These are the kinds of essentially pranks that smart, rebellious kids with modern technology would come up with, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at what they're saying, it's very different from previous generations. It's not, they don't have a political agenda per se. And if you told them support this politician, they would probably laugh at you. Essentially, they're trying to do some merry prankster shit as the country collapses around them. That's basically where they're coming from.
But yeah, there would be no point in having some political theory about it. No. There's no outlet for them. So
that's where they're coming from. Yeah. They're, insofar as they're expressing politics, it's doing things like Anonymous, exposing the powerful, breaking some hedge funds as, through a crazy scheme that actually worked. Right? things like that.
Yeah. And I kind of look forward to seeing what the next one will be. Yeah.
While they did a study on another level, Gen Z is perhaps the most conservative generation since World War II. And what they mean by conservative, they're the most diverse generation in history, so they're liberal on diversity, social issues. But this study came up with just some crazy numbers. Like 21% had a bank account before they were 10, had a savings account. And I believe it's 79% between the ages of 14 and 25 report that they work for their own money. So it's basically what they've taken away from the world that they lived in. Nobody's going to help you, right? You need to cover your ass. You need to take care of yourself. So I raise this because you're talking about, well, what do we do? I think a lot of us on the left have been thinking there's going to be a demographic salvation. No, not based on that. No. Not based on that.
No, not based on anything.
I mean, what Chris is doing and what people like him are doing, God bless him. And I think ultimately what Chris is doing is going to make the lives of thousands, if not tens of thousands of Amazon workers better, because ultimately, because once they see it could be done in the deep South, they're all going to want to do it. Right.
Of course. Yeah.
So the question, what should you do on the idealistic side? Do what Hedges is doing. Try to make things better where you are. He volunteers in prisons. That's kind of one of his main activities. Try to help people. It's the old fall back on golden rule stuff. Do unto others. Be a nice person. In terms of fixing the society, the system has to collapse before you can do anything about it.
Well, I think one of the things he does that actually you and I both do is try to at least get the word out, get some kind of alternative ideas out there in people's heads so that they are not just completely consumed by the corporate propaganda, and they perhaps will be encouraged to think for themselves.
Well, that is why I do it. And on some occasion, like you might ask, well, if you believe this, why do you even do this? And I honestly, I can't say it's because I enjoy it. I'm an introverted autodidact. I'm a guy who can be very happy just sitting home, learning things and not getting involved in broader matters. Honestly, Bernie Sanders did convince me in his initial campaign that I had a responsibility as a citizen to try to do what I could. And so that's what I would say. Do what you can. I'm just being honest about what I see as the macro forces at work. And I think the system, I was even saying that when I was campaigning for Sanders in 2016. I told my wife, we'd go out. We went to Massachusetts on Super Tuesday to knock on doors. But what did I tell her privately? I said, the system's too far gone. And I thought that you can't fix this. No. It's too corrupted. Even if Bernie got elected, they would pull a Venezuela on America. Like essentially the wealthy would pull their capital out. They would have to make sure that anything he didn't work. They would have to fuck the country, right? So the system has to
bother them at all.
No, come on, they'll just learn to speak Mandarin.
Yeah.
The system has to collapse before it can be transformed. If you don't want to take that kind of a ride, Irish people, I understand, can claim dual citizenship if they have Irish grandparents. If you have any kind of hookup like that. And then there are a lot of nice Canadian people that might marry you.
Yeah. Well, no, I do think that's, were I a lot younger, I think that's what I would consider doing, getting the hell out of this country, because, it's going right down the tubes. You might as well be someplace that, has at least a chance. I think we better cut it off here. It's been almost an hour. So thanks again. I appreciate it. Thanks again to Russell Dobular for joining me today. This podcast will go out right away, and the radio show, of course, will have certain words removed. But I hope if you're around in Oregon and you're able to listen to it on the radio, that's great too. Anyway, we'll catch you up next time. This is Charles Dunaway. Thank you for listening to Wider View.